Thank you for joining our Kubernetes masterclass today. It's Tuesday, November 10th, and today's topic will be on Service Mesh with Istio in the new Rancher 2.5. So a quick intro to your team today. As you all know, I am your host, Connie Lin. I'm Manager of Global Events at Rancher, and I'm joined today by our Field Engineer, Jason, and Bastian Hoffman, who will be helping with questions. You gentlemen say a quick hello.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad that you could all make the time to come watch my Istio presentation.
Yeah, and also hello from me, and keep the questions coming.
Great. Thank you both for joining today. Before I hand it over to Jason, just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So our class today will run roughly 45 to 75 minutes with a presentation, a demo, and then Q&A. If you have any questions, please pop them into the questions tab on your GoToWebinar panel. All Q&A will be done via text, so ask away at any point during the webinar. We also have a Slack channel dedicated to our Kubernetes masterclasses on our user Slack. So head over to slack.rancher.io to join the conversation. And last but not least, we know that, thank you again for joining our webinar today with virtual events. We rely heavily on technology, so please be patient with us as we want to make sure we have everything in working order, and sometimes connections might not be 100%. So we will do our best to keep this flowing. So let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. I will hand it over to Jason to get started.
I think so. So generally speaking, I'm going to, unless anybody in the comments or questions wants to see the full screen view, I'm going to be swapping back and forth from the live demos to the presentation pretty fluidly. So I'll probably keep this presentation as most of looking like this. Without further ado, welcome everybody. As Connie introduced, my name is Jason Skrzypek, a field engineer with Rancher Labs. I've been with Rancher Labs for about a year now. Previous to that, I was a consultant with other Kubernetes products, and previous to that, I was basically a large microservice user / developer. And so Istio is kind of my niche, and I'm excited to show you what the changes that have been made in the Istio project since the Istio 1.5 release that's in Rancher 2.4, and changes that have been made to the way that we as Rancher deploy Istio into 2.5 clusters. The agenda for today, and at any point in time, if you want to interrupt me, please do. I'll keep an eye on the questions as they're streaming by. Bastian will do his best job to make sure that I see and respond to everything that's in there. But this is the agenda for today. I'm going to talk about the installation of Istio. I'm going to talk about the architecture of Istio between 2.4 and 2.5. I'm going to talk about the new components, the components that kind of fell off the Istio project. I'm going to talk about operating an Istio cluster through Rancher and through the CLI. And then lastly, time permitting, I'll talk about the automation of Istio, its components, and workloads on top of Istio. And the disclaimer here is that it's 6 months and 60 minutes, so we may not, this isn't going to be a completely comprehensive recap of everything that's happened with all of these components. I can go into greater depth if people determine that they want to go into greater depth in certain things, but I have a surface level versus to a little bit deeper level presentation in mind. That being said, this is a masterclass. Ideally, you would have a basic understanding of the following. Rancher, at least having some familiarity with what Rancher is, a Kubernetes orchestrator, having an understanding of Helm, more or less the package manager for Kubernetes, and then with what Istio is in general. If you don't have that basic information at hand, you can certainly continue listening. Some of the stuff that I mentioned, some of the screens that I show might not be too relevant, but I've also included in this presentation links to both of those, or all three of those components, so that if you're following this back up when it gets sent out to you afterwards, you can pause the video, look through these docs, get familiar with that, and then continue on. So for those of you that are currently running Istio or have started to play around with the thought of running Istio in your environment, this blog article that was hosted on the CNCF blog back in October, at the end of October, Service Mesh is still hard. Lin Sun, I believe, is an IBM senior technical staff member, at IBM. They said it best when they said the five things that you see on the right. I would recommend, if you're interested in what makes Service Mesh hard, or maybe some of the unknown difficulties that you might run into with Service Mesh, that you go over and you check out this link. But the highlights, the 5 different points that are mentioned in this article, are that there's still a lack of clear guidance on whether or not you need a service mesh. A lot of people are operating Kubernetes and doing microservices even without a service mesh, and their clusters are still reporting healthy. They're not dealing with any unknown issues. Secondly, that your service may break immediately after a sidecar is injected. I think the issue, in the article, they referenced a Zookeeper installation. That Zookeeper installation has requirements on the networking stack that once the sidecar and the proxy are injected into the pod, it just broke everything, and it was not a very fun process to bring that all back together. Next, there was your service may have an odd behavior at start or stop time. One thing I will mention towards the end of this presentation is that the Istio team have made corrections to the code base so that it kind of accounts for this, but this is still a factor. Even though Istio and Service Mesh, the whole concept behind a Service Mesh is that it's removing the configuration from the service. It's not going to make it, you're not going to just inject your code into a Service Mesh and everything's going to be hunky-dory. You're going to have to make some accommodation for the fact that you will be running in a Service Mesh to get the best value out of it. And then lastly, the service owner needs to understand the nuances of client and server-side configurations. I don't think anybody here is under the opinion that Istio is a simple project. Istio has a lot of moving pieces. It's, well, less so now, but it's been moving relatively fast, and sometimes it's difficult to stay on top of that. I think the article specifically references the interactions with timeouts and things that are encapsulated with the virtual services and the destination rules. So to start off, we're going to need an environment to show Istio, either Istio 2. In the 2.4 sense or Istio in the 2.5 sense. I think, yep, my first slide here is Istio in versions less than 2.5. The cluster that I'm going to be installing Istio. Well, I have Istio installed on a cluster that's being managed by a Rancher 2.5 instance, but it's using the older version of the chart. As you can see on the right, it's going to be using the Istio 1.5.9 version. That version is going to be exposed through the Ember UI. That's the UI that you're familiar with if you're already running Rancher. It's entirely Helm-based. Istio had, at one point in time, I think back in March, they fully supported Helm as an installation method, istioctl as an installation method, the operator as an installation method, and there might have been one additional one. But now they've kind of moved away from out of all 3 of those, and primarily focus on the operator and istioctl. The things that are included in your Rancher Istio 2.5 installation are going to be Prometheus for metrics, Grafana for visualizing those metrics, Jaeger for distributed tracing, and Kiali for observability of your service mesh. The things that you can configure in the UI, and similarly, if you wanted to go through and modify these directly from the API, as you can with most Rancher objects, you'll have the ability to modify Kiali. You can see this group access up here is how you change the authentication for Kiali. Pilot, that's going to give you the ability to configure. Most of these are basically going to be memory and CPU usage. And then Ingress Gateway, which I have a typo here, is going to is going to help you deploy, is going to configure whether or not you're deploying your ingress as a node port, as a layer 4 load balancer, and a couple of the various configurations there. And the last thing I mentioned here on the slide is that it can be upgraded from Istio 1.4, specifically in the context of Rancher. Istio in general has a practice where they don't recommend or suggest that you skip Istio installations. So you go from 1.4 to 1.5 to 1.6 to 1.7, and that'll become relevant as I go into the next slide. But before I jump off of this slide, I'm going to switch over to my Rancher environment. Bastian, could you confirm that you can see my Chrome browser now with Rancher on it?
Yep, looks good.
Cool. So this, for those of you who may or may not be familiar, this is the Rancher environment. You can see down in the lower left that I'm running 2.5.1. Interesting tidbit, we just released 2.5.2 a little bit ago, and that should have more features that you won't even see here. What we have in this environment is I have a single Rancher instance running on K3s, just one node. I have 3 clusters in total. I have Istio 1.5, which is going to be, understandably, my cluster that's using the old installation method that has Istio 1.5.9 installed on it, or 1.5. I forget what the patch version is. 1.5, yep, 1.5.9. And then I'll have a cluster that has Istio 1.7 installed on it through the new UI, through the new functionality. And then if I want to demonstrate anything live and test my luck with the demo gods, I have a fresh cluster that's got 3 nodes that has nothing installed on it, and I could go through the process of installing any one of the components. So the thing I wanted to show first is the basic idea, for those of you maybe who haven't even used Istio within Rancher, how simple it is to install Istio here. So on this cluster, if you click at this cluster, you can see I've already enabled Istio, so you're already seeing the monitoring. But to enable Istio in the cluster, you click in the context of the cluster, you get the cluster view, then you go out into the Tools tab, click Istio. This is where you see the configuration that I had in the slide deck. I can specify Istio version 1.5.9, primarily because I'm not going to, I think in 2.5.1, that's the only one that's available through this UI. You can see the group access that I mentioned. The group access is going to give me the ability to control who can and cannot view KLI. There's a pilot configuration, which, like I said, is basically just CPU and memory. You can control the trace sampling percentage. I think I want to make a special note here that in Istio 1.7, they've updated the entire way that trace sampling is being exposed. There's a new API that's exposing that information, and so this functionality just wouldn't correlate if we were to update it to 1.7. Similarly, Mixer is going to be what handles all of your policy. In 1.5, there's tracing. Tracing again is going to be Jaeger distributed tracing to find out where your HTTP requests are actually going. Ingress gateway. I don't know if it's going to be relevant, but I do have an ingress gateway enabled. I have it set up as a load balancer type, and I haven't configured anything else there. Those are all of the options that I have enabled. You can also see that I haven't installed any custom answers. These custom answers are going to be where you might, prior to 2.5, make modifications to the Helm charts that are deploying the Istio project. Once you've gone through and done that, you'll be able to see the Istio components. Those Istio components will live in the system project. Give that a second to load. If you click on the apps, we'll see that there's 3 different applications that have been deployed. There's the monitoring operator and the cluster monitoring, and there's cluster Istio. Cluster Istio is just going to be everything outside of monitoring. That's going to include Jaeger, Kiali, all of the Istio components, and some webhook components. Going back over to the PowerPoint presentation. How does that process change when we go into Istio 2.5? You can see that it's using a new UI. Things are slightly shifted. You can see more YAML there. You can see a little bit more I guess, shading and different way that the boxes are oriented. This is going to use a combination of Helm and the Istio operator. And it's probably better for me to show rather than discuss that right now because it's kind of a nuanced approach, and I don't want to confuse more people. What this includes out of the box, as compared to Prometheus, Grafana, Jaeger, and Kiali, is currently it only includes Kiali as the add-on, but it doesn't involve a lot more UI configuration options. You'll see here that it involves the CNI. It involves pilot, policy, telemetry, egress gateway, and the ingress gateway. Egress gateway is a new one that wasn't really even, you couldn't really even make use of that in the previous installation. And then like I had mentioned earlier, this is going to start with Istio 1.7.1, and that's how you're going to maintain the process from there on out. So as I did with the previous example, I'll show you how I would go through and install that in this environment. It's going to be a little bit more of a multi-stage process. This cluster, the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce you to the Explorer view. You can see next to each of these clusters, there's a button. Click on that Explorer button. That will take you to the new UI. Give my cluster a second. Apparently it wants to be slow today. There we go. That's going to be a lot of information. Let me make that a little bit smaller so you can see more of it. Just I guess, a general overview, you can still see the components that are running on a cluster. You can see the basic stats, such as how it was provisioned, what the version is, the total node count, some of the basic scheduling components, and then the event stream. This is more or less the cluster view from before. If you want to exec into a shell so that you can run kubectl commands, that shell button up here is going to make that available to you. And then if you want to navigate back home to the cluster explorer, you can do it, or the cluster manager, the previous view, you could do that. And we're going to go back into cluster explorer. On the left, you can see a list of all of the resources that live on this cluster. Well, I guess all of the types that are on this cluster, the resources you can filter through. But the important button for the context of this discussion is going to be this apps button. This apps button is just like we saw before with the apps from the old UI. They're just Helm charts. They're the way that applications are going to be bundled and deployed into your environments. You might think that what we see here, this Rancher Istio button, we just click that and install it just like we did the one-click install for the previous Istio. That's not 100% true. This Istio has a requirement that it's running with either a custom-defined monitoring stack, or in order for some of the components to work, or the Rancher bundled monitoring stack. Generally speaking, I would recommend using the Rancher bundled monitoring stack. It's going to, as Batching can attest to, it's going to be basically what's commonly used in the open source community with very little customizations. And I'll go into greater detail there when I talk about integrations with Rancher. But what we're going to do is, if we go to monitoring, what I could do to install, actually, let me do this on the fresh cluster. Fresh cluster, you can see nothing's there. Click Cluster Explorer. If we go back to apps, we'll click on Rancher Monitoring. I'm going to use all of the defaults. I'm not going to change a single thing. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, click Install. That's going to deploy the Helm chart. It's going to pop up a shell that's going to give me a terminal that's going to give me reports of how the process is going, and it's going to take me into the view of the installed application. Rancher monitoring, without going into too much detail, is going to require a whole bunch of CRDs. I mean, most applications these days require CRDs. I can't think of too many that are deployed simply with Kubernetes resources. And then it's going to deploy the Rancher monitoring components. That shouldn't take too long. Guess I can wait for a second while that's going on. I'll use this opportunity though to ask if let me drill through the questions to see if there's anything relevant.
Maybe there was one about Citadel in the new Istio installation. Is this still included there, or is it replaced by something?
So I'll talk about the architecture in greater detail in a little bit. All of the functionality has been consolidated into a single Istio daemon. That daemon is going to include both the authn, authz, the certificate management, and the pilot for distributing those configurations, and the various other components that comprise a service mesh. So while it's not immediately called out as existing, as its independent microservice, the functionality has been converted into the Istio daemon component. Cool. Feel free to ask more about that once we get into the architecture section. We see that that's not successfully deployed. It went from pending to deployed. Now we go through and go back into Apps Marketplace, go to Charts, click on Rancher Istio. This is where we see the graphic from before. We can see the version that I'm running. I could start with 1.7 and upgrade to 1.7.3. I'm just going to do 1.7.3. There's not too many functional differences between 1.7.1 and 1.7.3. But you're going to see a bunch of options over here that need a little bit of explanation. As you can see, first and foremost on this README page, that Kiali is where the dependency for the Rancher monitoring comes from. Kiali, if you're familiar with Istio Service Mesh, is going to be what's going to give you the visibility, and Prometheus Kiali is going to need Prometheus to be able to report on specific requests and endpoints. The components that I mentioned in the previous conversation were CNI, pilot, ingress gateway, policy, egress gateway, and telemetry. You can see that by default, pilot, ingress gateway, and telemetry are enabled. One of the reasons I would say that, generally speaking, CNI, policy, and egress gateway have been non-primary features. I would probably recommend, if nothing else, for security, enabling the CNI, and then for the ability to treat the traffic that's entering your cluster the same way as you would when it leaves the cluster, the egress gateway. The policy is still in kind of a transitional period while they deprecate Mixer and wrap all that functionality into Envoy itself. So it's up to you whether or not you want to deploy that. I'll keep that deployed just because I want to keep this environment on the exact same way that I have the other environment. We click down to custom overlay file. This is where we're going to introduce the concept of the Istio operator. The Istio operator is going to be, which, as you can see here, a manifest that's going to give you, it's going to contain the configuration. The configuration is going to look rather similar to what you're used to with Helm value components. So for instance, if I wanted to deploy an ingress gateway usually has most of the things in the Helm for Istio had an enabled flag right in the beginning. They had a name, they had some resources and some services, the way it's exposed, and then they had some more complex configuration. You can see this one's really just an example of what you can do with the overlay. And in this case, just for full visibility, if we were to completely comment this out, this would allow us to deploy an ingress gateway with the name Istio Ingress Gateway that's enabled with all the defaults. There's going to be an additional load balancer, well, an additional gateway that's an internal load balancer in the namespace user ingress gateway. And then there's also going to be, I believe this last one is just another miscellaneous gateway that's going to be deployed in Istio system. For now, I'm going to leave that blank, and and the reason I'm going to do that is because later on in the discussion, we'll have the ability to, well, I'll talk about the inherited structure from overlay file to a values.yaml file and how it goes from a Helm chart to the Istio operator.
Jason, there's one request. Could you maybe zoom in a bit, please, so to make it a bit larger?
Cool. Is that good?
Yeah, works for me.
Cool. So, like I said, those are the three components there. Clicking on the values.yaml, this is going to be the values files that are passed into the Helm chart that is going to deploy the Istio operator. A lot of this configuration will seem very similar. Again, there's configuration for global. Global is going to have, and you're going to have ingress gateway configuration. You're going to have core DNS configuration. Kiali, again, you can see the auth strategy like we had in the UI and the other component. There's going to be mesh config. There's going to be pilot, policy, and telemetry. One of the things about telemetry that I want to mention here, well, I guess telemetry and policy, is that telemetry, you have the choice of using either the Rancher Istio mixer telemetry, which is going to be using the deprecated mixer components. If you want to continue using telemetry the way that you were previously in 2.4, in Rancher 2.4, or you can switch over to the V2 telemetry. Similarly, policy here, like I said, it's kind of in a half state where they're migrating the functionality over to the Envoy components. You'll see we're using the Istio mixer component still if you want to make use of those. And that's primarily why I suggested that it's up to your choice whether or not you want to enable policy, because that's using a deprecated feature. Last thing here is going to be Helm options. That's just going to be for the deployment itself. So what we're going to do now is we're going to click install. Once we go to install, similar to the way that we deployed monitoring, we'll see that shell. I'm going to minimize that. We'll see that there's a Kiali server CRD. Kiali, like I said, with the monitoring component, is going to require a CRD so that it can deploy its resources. Then we're just going to deploy Rancher Istio. I don't think I need to wait here for this. I can continue back into the presentation because I think Istio is going to take a little bit of time. We'll give it a couple more seconds to see how it goes.
Maybe in between, I have two questions.
Okay.
First one is, do you know anything about Windows support for Istio?
I don't believe Istio has that Envoy has a Windows image yet. I know it has an ARM image, but I do not believe that it has a Windows. And that's going to be the requirement for Istio to work with Windows. I mean, so it's going to have to, unless you wanted to virtualize everything on top of a Windows server. But at that point, you're defeating the purpose for going over to Windows in the first place.
I think I also just saw a open GitHub issue once for Envoy with little things happening there, but that is also a couple months ago. Second question is, can you also use Istio together with an Nginx Ingress controller, or do you need to use the Istio gateways? And maybe also, can you elaborate a bit what the difference is?
Yep. As a matter of fact, I might point you into my previous masterclass, API gateways versus service mesh, or whatever it was named. At that point, I talked about the pre 2.5 Rancher, where I deployed Istio using the first example, and then I put 3 different ingress controllers in front of it, and I got the traffic from those ingress controllers into the service mesh. The 3 ingress controllers that I demoed were the Glue from Solo.io, Kong from, I forget what the name of Kong's parent company is. It might just be Kong, and then Ambassador. The 2 of those are based on Envoy. One of them itself is just an Nginx ingress. So yeah, it's certainly doable. And the article, I guess, is a short answer. There's a good blog article on the Kubernetes blog, Kong ingress, Kubernetes.io, Kong ingress controller, and Istio Service Mesh, which shows you how to do that jump from Kong as the ingress gateway to a service mesh.
Connie also just put the link into the chat to the previous masterclass.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Cool. So were there any other questions before I move on?
Nope, not so far. Cool. I think there's another one, but we can cover this later in the architecture section.
All right. Yeah, which is fast upon us. I just wanted to point out before I move over that Rancher Istio finished deploying. We can see now on the top left in this dropdown, we have both a monitoring tab popped up and an Istio tab popped up. And in that Istio tab, we can see the various components of Istio, including Kiali. So that's the differences between installing Istio in Rancher 2.4 or in the previous version and the current 2.5 version. A couple of the questions that when I first ran into this, I asked is, why did Rancher introduce the operator? That's primarily because Istio stopped supporting the Helm integration, and we needed a way to continue to stay lockstep with the Istio project. Where did the integrations go? I have a link. This is actually a symlink. There we go. They had an article about reworking their add-on integrations. Basically, they weren't providing the best examples of each of those integrations, and it was difficult to integrate pre-existing versions of them with the Istio project. So to make Istio more effective at providing the service mesh functionality, they removed those from the project and allowed you to integrate them externally. Why did Rancher introduce the operator? Oh, I said that twice. I should remove that. Can I still configure limits and requests? That is all going to be doable either through the overlay or through the values file. And then do I have to learn more YAML? At present, there is going to be something of a learning curve where you have to learn the overlay. You may have to learn the overlay structure as well as the values file, but for the most part, you can operate Istio with the default options, and I'll show you that you're not losing any functionality by just using the default here. I think the last thing before I go into the architecture section is going to be the way that overlays, values, and the base templates interact in 2.5. So if you remember from the, let's see, what's the best way to show that? I'll just bring this back. We go back to apps and marketplace, installed apps. We look at Rancher Istio. Actually, no, I want to look at this one. You can see components, overlay file, and values.yaml. So the way this is structured is, like I said, there's a Helm chart that's going to deploy an Istio installer. That Istio installer is going to take your custom overlay file and it's going to merge it with the base overlay file. I can show an example of that here. If we look at 2.5 charts, Rancher, I can make this bigger too. Rancher Istio, we can see that the chart itself, the values are going to be what's reported in the values file that we saw down below. These values are going to be put into the templates like a normal chart. You can see that there is a base config map. That's going to take data from a template, and that template is going to be based on the values that you put in combination with the overlay. There's the base with the values put into it. And then the overlay is going to be created with something like this, overlay example. It's just going to do the merge operation, and then you're going to get the resulting Kubernetes cluster. One of the benefits of doing it this way is that with the Istio operator, we have additional validation that we can run with your configuration. So with Helm, there was a lot of permutations as to how things could be created. The Istio operator kind of solidifies the configuration approaches and gives you the ability to know in advance whether or not it's going to impact your cluster. Cool. So that took a little bit longer than expected. We're into the architecture section now. Architecture of the previous Rancher, of the previous install of Istio, which is either 1.5 or 1.4. You'll notice that there's a lot of components here at play. There's going to be the control plane. The control plane, as someone previously mentioned, is going to include Citadel, Galley, Injector, Pilot. Mixer is going to be doing all of the policy and telemetry. And then you've got the actual data plane, which is going to have the node agents, the Istio agents, and the proxies themselves. The way that this is deployed in 1.5, technically the Istio project changed over to the daemon view, which is going to consolidate all of those into one component. But as we were using the Helm chart installation, it made the most sense to continue using that until we cut over in Rancher 2.5. Everything in this case is going to be installed in the Istio system namespace. And like I showed in the presentation earlier, system apps are going to be created named cluster Istio, cluster monitoring, and monitoring operator. This second view is a lot simpler. Everything's going to be encapsulated in this Istio-D. This Istio-D is then just going to communicate with the proxies, do all of the XDS, the secrets discovery, the handling of the auth-N, the auth-Z, and all of the components that you can think of. Technically, if we are enabling the policy features, then there will be additional components, but I can show you the differences in the Rancher UI. So if we go back here, go back to my Rancher instance, starting with the old version, I'm going to Istio 1.5 in the system project. If we look at let's just look at this cluster Istio project, we can see that it's got a whole bunch of components. There's the Istio Citadel, there's Galley, there's the Ingress Gateway, Pilot Policy, Injector, Telemetry Tracing, and Kiali. There's a bunch of services for each of those, and a bunch of config maps and secrets. No, there's actually no secrets in this case. That's a lot to maintain. They did that primarily so that they were operating in a way that made sense for a service mesh that was going to be producing lots of microservices, but it ultimately didn't pan out. It didn't help as much as they thought it would, and it just made maintaining an Istio cluster something of a burden. Moving into the modern installation method, if we look at the Cluster Explorer, and we look at, actually no, let's go back to the Cluster Manager to do a more direct comparison. Cluster Manager, we look at the system project now. We look at workloads. We can now see in the Istio system namespace, because I did install the CNI, there's going to be a CNI component on each of the nodes. It's still going to include the egress gateway and the ingress gateway. These are just going to be deployments of Envoy that are specifically meant to handle the cluster boundary. Because we enabled policy in this cluster, that's just going to be the Istio mixer components. Istio-D is going to be there. And then the rest of the components outside of Kiali are for Jaeger that I installed for my own personal benefit, which I'll show you in a little bit. That still seems like a lot, I know, but Istio-D is going to be where most of it, if we were to install the simplest version of the service mesh, maybe we were just trying to get the MVP for a project or a proof of concept, Istio-D with an ingress gateway would be, Istio-D with an ingress gateway and Kiali would be the only three components that are deployed. Cool. So that's generally speaking what the architecture differences look like. There's definitely more that you could talk about if you look at Istio-D itself. But just know that the architecture is definitely trending in a direction where more of the responsibilities are falling on Envoy, and because Envoy is becoming more and more featured as it gets more mature, and having it all in one place makes a lot of sense. So I'll take this as another opportunity to answer any architecture questions.
One question regarding architecture was, why with Rancher we prefer to deploy Istio using a Helm chart rather than istioctl?
So Rancher, I think the best way to look at it is that Rancher tries to provide many means of interaction with all of the components that you deploy. A lot of people Kubernetes is not a very simple thing to manage, and a lot of people prefer to use the UI. The UI, obviously, I guess we could make an entire deployment for istioctl that integrates with the UI, but we would ultimately have to do that with the CLIs for each of the components that we're integrating with each Kubernetes cluster, whereas the standard interface for deploying third-party applications has basically become Helm. Helm in a combination with Kustomize to get a consistent way to add things to a cluster. And I guess efficiency is the main driver there. Just making it so that we can provide the value on top of all of these Kubernetes third-party apps without having to make it proprietary to each one of them.
Maybe also to add there is that the Istio Helm chart that we provide is actually using istioctl under the hood.
Right. Yeah, and I can show that too. Actually, let me do that now. That's a good point. So Rancher Istio installer. The Helm chart is going to deploy this Rancher Istio installer. And this Rancher Istio installer is going to run a couple scripts without going into too much detail, but you can see that we're running istioctl analyze to make sure that the files are, that we'll be able to deploy Istio in this environment, istioctl install to make sure that we're adding both of the overlays. If we're doing an upgrade, we can do an istioctl upgrade, and then there's the reverse. There's the uninstall Istio, which is going to get all of the manifests based on istioctl and then remove them with kubectl. Cool. All right.
Sorry for interruption. There was one mention. If you maybe can scroll or click around a bit slower, because with low connections, sometimes it takes a bit for the screen to refresh.
I certainly can.
Like a tiny bit.
Cool. So the next category is going to be components. I talked a little bit about this in both the installation and the architecture, but this is basically a single slide that shows what's happened in the change from Rancher's previous installation method to the new installation method, as well as the modifications going from 1.7 to, or 1.5 to 1.7. The components are going to be derived from the way that Rancher's changed things. We now expose the CNI. The CNI, as I pointed out in previous master classes, the main impetus behind using that is going to be to reduce the security requirements for your service mesh. Running the CNI means you don't need to run the Istio init containers, and therefore you don't need to make, you don't require as many system capabilities. Second part, which I already did mention too, was the egress gateway. Egress gateway, a lot of people require the ability to maybe control which IP address or which IP range the services are leaving their cluster from. Maybe there's a firewall in between your cluster and some other service. Egress gateway is a way to do that. Apart from that, you can also control maybe what services inside your cluster have access to outside of your cluster. There's policy. Policy, I say that it's major change. It's still using Mixer, but we're allowing you the ability to use the newer features, and we're taking into account the fact that it will be deprecated. And the last thing is telemetry. We have the support for both V1 and V2. V1 being the Mixer and the Mixer deployment, and V2 being more of the native Envoy components. On the changelog side of things, you'll see that there are resources modified by Istio. The first two, authentication.istio.io and rback.istio.io, those were removed. Those have been long in the works for being deprecated. rback and, well, specifically authentication.istio.io was replaced by the two components, pure authentications and request authentications. And then the RBAC is handled by, well, the RBAC is handled by the request authentications, and the authentication.io is usually handled by the pure authentications. The two other components here, the workload entries and the Istio operators. Istio operators is just going to be the functionality that allows the Istio operator to work. This is, you'll notice that it's plural because you can have, there is going to be the concept of having multiple Istios inside the same cluster. The concept of a canary upgrade for Istio, which we'll talk about, hopefully we'll talk about for the end of this presentation. And then workload entries are going to be, Istio has recently made a push to better integrate with non-Kubernetes resources. Workload entries are going to give you access to virtual machines as if they were on the cluster, or as if they were part of the mesh, I guess I should say. And the last two things down below, I'll point out that these were in existence beforehand, but Rancher has now brought them to the forefront of your configuration, because the way that you interact with Istio is probably going to involve them more often as Istio adapts and evolves. Sidecars are going to be how traffic is going to basically be transmitted through the sidecar in one direction or the other. Envoy filters are going to be the filter chain that has to be gone through before a request can make it all the way through to the destination. Envoy is going to give you the ability to use filters to maybe filter out requests that don't have a specific header, maybe start using making requests only allowable for specific users, so on and so forth. There's a couple examples in the Rancher clusters when you deploy them. Those are primarily for monitoring components. Then the peer authentications and the request authentications. The peer authentications are going to be communications within your cluster. For instance, making sure that a service in one namespace communicates directly with another service in another namespace over MTLS, or if it's in permissive mode. And then request authentications is going to be more of what you think of when you think of RBAC. It's going to be, I want a user to only be able to do GET posts on this environment, on this service, and maybe even down to this path. Cool. Again, this is a lot to take on all at once. You don't have to be an expert in any of these components to get use out of your Istio Service Mesh. I just wanted to make sure that you had a single place to view if you were curious about what's changed in the jump from Rancher 2.4 to 2.5. Cool. So I'll take a break here to get a drink of water, and then Bastion, if there are any more questions, please send them.
No, not at the moment. I think we answered everything. Yeah.
Cool. I'm sorry about going too fast. Like I said, there's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure I get to at least to most of it. The fun part is now we're now at the fun part though. Now I get to go back to the Rancher environments and show you some of the components and how I interact with the new installation. As you might have seen, the monitoring components were removed, I guess, or disconnected from the Rancher Istio installation. There was that two-step process where I had to deploy Rancher monitoring first, and then I deployed Istio. The motivations behind that are, again, the Istio team wanted to make sure that you were deploying, that the people responsible for instance, the visibility of your metrics and for the way that the metrics are being scraped and configured are in the experts' hands, the Prometheus team in this case. And they didn't want to be responsible for keeping everything at the same pace and cadence as the Prometheus team. One of the ways that they did that is they just dumped the Grafana dashboards out into the public, and that is something that you can pull down and run on your own, assuming that you have Grafana that's looking into a data source that has Istio. Secondly, there's going to be a lot more flexibility in the way that you can configure your monitoring for your service mesh. You're going to be using the Kubernetes native components in Rancher to service monitors and rules, and I have a link here to a list of rules that are best practices for Istio. That's going to give you the ability to interact or to expose only what you want exposed as far as metrics are concerned, and not to maybe flood your monitoring stack. In that same regard, there's the concept of a Prometheus merge that I'll talk about a little. Prometheus merge is going to give you the ability to expose application metrics through the sidecar alongside the Istio metrics. So there's an Istio metric, Istio request total, that could live right alongside Spring Boot app gRPC connections or something like that. That way you don't have to have multiple scrapers pointing to the same workload. And then lastly, one of the recommendations from this best practices link is going to be to federate your Prometheus metrics. That's going to be much easier to do. It's still going to be somewhat difficult to do just because it's a more complicated process. But if you're running an Istio environment and you have the scale of maybe hundreds of microservices, you're going to crush your monitoring stack with the cardinality of your metrics. And federating Prometheus allows you to essentially buffer your monitoring stack from that load. Okay, and so with that said, let me show you the comparison of the old Grafana introduction, the old Grafana, the old Prometheus, and the new way that you would do that. So back to Rancher, if we look at back to the global context so that we all have our same bearings, Istio 1.5 was the old cluster. To look at the components that were installed with that old cluster, let's choose the default project. In that default project, we can see the Istio resource. Istio resource, I don't currently have any traffic on that right now. Let me see if I can fix that. Cool. Let me also do that for the other cluster. Cool, that'll start populating in a little bit once the traffic gets through. But what you see here in the old view are links to Kiali, Jaeger, Grafana, and Prometheus. The ones that we ultimately care about right now, since I just talked about them, are going to be Prometheus and Grafana. If we look at Prometheus, we can see that we have access to the Istio metrics here. The one I recall I talked about earlier, Istio request total, execute. You can see that there aren't too many Istio. Oh, I clicked on the wrong one. I can type requests total. There we go. You can see all of the requests. This is just the book info application. So if you can understand that now a little bit, why you need to federate the metrics. Again, if we want to look at the graph, you can see the graph of all the traffic. If we go back, we can now see that since I have traffic flowing through this environment, I have some Grafana dashboards proxied out or exposed on the Rancher UI. If we wanted to look at them directly through Grafana, we have a link there. That's just going to expose standard Grafana dashboards. So for instance, if we wanted to look at the workload, we can look at the workload in the default system. Let's go to product page. Product page has all of these various stats about it. You can see when I started to send the automated request to that endpoint. Cool. And so there's not really too much in the way of configuration after that I would recommend doing after installation with the old version. Whereas if we go into the new version, you have some flexibility. Going into Istio 1.7, which has the new version installed, go to the Explorer. We're back into the new UI. If you remember, the new UI is going to expose both Istio and monitoring tabs once we install them. Click on the monitoring tab. If we look at here, we can see again links for Grafana and Prometheus, but we can also additionally see links for Alert Manager, Prometheus rules. One of the nice things about the monitoring changes in Istio 2.5 or in Rancher 2.5 is that Alert Manager has been restructured for the cluster, and you have much more finer grained access to that. But similar to what we were seeing previously, if we look at the Prometheus graph, we can see Istio request total. Again, we see the same information. Wow, see a lot more information. We can see the graph of all the requests. That's going to behave exactly like you expect it to. And then additionally, we could also see Grafana. Grafana is just, again, going to be your splash page. And we can look for the Istio. Let's look at the workload dashboard, and then we'll go back to the product page example that I showed previously. There should be traffic flowing to this cluster. Let's double check. There we go. Just took a little bit to load. Again, you can see the spike of where I started sending the automated traffic and the various data that you might want for a specific workload, specific service. The last thing I want to point out before we move on beyond Prometheus is going to be the way that this is deployed within the fact that you have visibility into how it's deployed as opposed to it just being a bundled application. So if we look over here in these tabs, you'll see that there are service monitors, pod monitors, Prometheus rules, alert managers, and Promethei. We're going to focus on a service monitor, which is going to allow us to monitor an Istio service. That the configuration for that is all going to be stored in the Istio system namespace. And the primary one that you're going to notice is going to be Envoy Stats Monitor. Basically, what this is going to do is this is going to create it's going to start searching for environments that match these selectors. The namespace selector is going to be any, and it's going to be any workload that's running Envoy, and that is going to be exposed on stats/Prometheus, and it's just going to pull all of those metrics from any of the Envoy components. So for instance, maybe you had a requirement that you wanted to change the default port for Envoy. I don't know why you'd want to, but you could change that at the service monitor level, and you could change that at the Istio configuration level, and you still have monitoring working the way that you wanted it to. The extensibility, the reason I bring this up is because for like the namespace selector, if you didn't want to focus on, maybe there's an environment that's a lower severity environment, maybe a dev environment or a QA environment that you really just don't care about getting the in-depth metrics of, you could do a namespace selector and choose not to get those metrics in there. And then just as an example, I made a reference to the rules in the previous slide. I deployed those rules here. Those rules are just going to give you aggregated totals for your entire Istio mesh. So for instance, the Istio request totals, you're going to get, for instance, per namespace and per pod. All right, so moving on. I did not talk about I didn't show an example of the Prometheus merge. Just understand that it's a way to make it so that you can scrape from a single endpoint. And I don't think we have time to go over a federated Prometheus solution here.
There was one question in between, if you could explain a bit more about the upgrade paths between version 1.4, 1.5 to 1.7.
That's a very good question. Yeah, right now, as I mentioned towards the beginning of this conversation, the Istio team doesn't recommend doing a jump by 2. So my standard approach right now would probably be to remove the cluster from the service mesh, running the Istio 1.5, and then just to redeploy the components with the new Istio. There are paths to get it to go from one to the other, but like I also said at the beginning of this, Istio itself is a very complicated framework, and if things go wrong, you could be spending a lot of engineering effort trying to uncover where things went wrong and how you're going to fix those. Anything else?
No, that's it for now.
All right. The next thing that I wanted to bring up is going to be tracing. I don't actually make a section here for Kiali, but I will show Kiali as well. Tracing was removed from the project, and currently Rancher doesn't have an integration or an application to deploy it. But one of the reasons why I personally support the removal of the Jaeger tracing from the built-in Istio project is that the version that they were bundling up and the configuration that they were bundling up was a much more lighter weight, not really production qualified installation. There are a lot of things that you can do with Jaeger apart from just the standard tracing. You can configure it with, I don't know if it had an HPA previously, but you can change the configuration format whether or not it's a sidecar or it's a daemon set, depending on how you want to control the network traffic. You can control whether or not all of the traces are being streamed through a dedicated streaming service like Kafka. You could even, there are deployment operations that allow you to deploy Kafka with the Jaeger operator. And then lastly, the deploying Jaeger outside of a bundled Istio component is going to give you much more flexibility with the way that you're persisting data and the ultimate backend that it's running on. One thing that I didn't mention here is that the Jaeger project is moving in the direction of interoperability with OpenTelemetry. But as far as how you would go about installing that, I personally am a fan. I've played around with it to some degree, and there are two ways that you can deploy Jaeger at present. For an environment that you're just trying out Jaeger and you just want to get some basic components, maybe not a production environment, there is on the Istio documentation under operations a quick and easy Jaeger deployment, which is just going to be a single kubectl command, which is just going to make a deployment with, I think, 2 services attached to it. That's going to be a fully functioning Jaeger endpoint. The way that I would recommend for production environments is going to be either the Jaeger operator, which is going to be similar to the way that you're maintaining the Istio itself, or just the Jaeger Helm chart. I can go briefly over the Jaeger operator and the way that I've deployed it here. If we go back to Cluster Explorer, this is the landing page for this cluster. This cluster is Istio 1.7. If I go to the apps and marketplace, you can see there's all of the Rancher included apps. There's the partner apps, and then I've added a repository that has the Jaeger operator and the Jaeger Helm charts. That's just a basic repository that's pointing to their GitHub repo and their master branch. I deployed that with basic configuration. If we look at this Jaeger deployment, I deployed it in the Istio system namespace. If we click view as YAML, we can see that the values here, these are all going to be actually that's not a good way to show it because those are the default pre-populated values. Let's go here, click upgrade. These are all the standard, I guess it's the same stuff, but I did not change any of the defaults. There's just going to be an image. You specify which image you want to use, which tag you want to use with that image, whether or not you've got a system default registry, and then I guess if you want to do pod security policy stuff. Once I did that, I went back into the cluster and I created a Jaeger object. That Jaeger object is, again, it looks complicated, but that is just to show that Jaeger has a lot more functionality that you probably didn't have access to in the previous Istio versions. But the things I want to focus on here are that I'm using an all-in-one strategy. I could have split it up kind of like in a way that you'd split up the microservices. And all of the components here are going to be default. That's what these empty curly braces are going to imply. There is some information here about the storage. I don't think I'm making use of that storage, so that's just information that's not going to be used. And then, yeah, the Elasticsearch components. But once I did that, I had in this namespace, I had a deployment. That deployment is going to be the Jaeger tracing. The operator is going to go through and create, based on the manifest that I passed it, a Jaeger deployment. That Jaeger deployment is going to expose the Zipkin API and a UI component. And once I did that, making sure that I pointed specifically to the Jaeger service, I have access to the Jaeger API. I believe I put that in an ingress. Yep. This ingress, if we look at the YAML, we can see, I don't think the host is set up here. Let me go back to the cluster manager to view it there. Go to default or system project. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of clicking. We go to workloads. Here we go. Oh, it is set up there. Let's edit that. I just want access to this to show you that it's the same UI. Let's automatically generate that. Click save. Give that a second. Jaeger UI. The Jaeger UI now has access to the Istio Ingress gateway. Find traces. We can see the standard stuff that you would see with your normal Jaeger integration. So that's Jaeger. One thing that I haven't actually shown yet is that Kiali behaves the same way. Kiali is actually the easiest component with Istio because it comes bundled in. Once I've installed Istio in the new UI, I go back to the Applications tab, click on Istio. I see the overview. This overview is going to give me a link to Kiali. That Kiali is going to expose basically the same Kiali information, which is going to be your graph for the most part. I think I lost my traffic. Generate some new traffic. We can see the request per second, the request percentage, whether or not there's a traffic animation. Let's turn that on. Circuit breakers, missing sidecars, virtual services, security for MTLS, all the niceties that Kiali brings to you. I guess I'll let that sit there for a little bit. You can see that it's just the standard product, book info, project, details, reviews, ratings. You can see when I disable the traffic animation that it's all running MTLS and that everything is reporting healthy. We're not getting any intermediate 500s or 300s or 400s. One thing I will point out here is that there's some Istio config validation that you can do from Kiali's window that's going to allow you to look at the various components. And in this editor, it's going to give you access to, it's going to do some validation of the Istio components to make sure that they follow the right spec. Okay. How are we doing on time? We're at 70 minutes. We've got administration and new features, and then I think I'll have to skip over the automation part so I can leave it the floor open for questions. So to wrap up this operations section, I want to talk about the value that you're getting out of Istio-CTL. Istio-CTL has a lot of functionality that I find myself using more and more of, as opposed to directly the UI, because the experience is, it's nice from, a diagnosis perspective, but it's also nice to be able to just throw the Istio-CTL commands into scripts to make sure that things are working properly, perhaps in my CI/CD workflow. So the main highlights on the right, you can see I did Istio-CTL help command. This is running Istio-CTL 1.7.4, which is technically one patch version above my installation. but everything behaves as expected. There, as you saw in the Istio installer, we're using the install operation, obviously, to install the components. We're using the analyze to make sure that the components that we're going to install are valid Istio configurations. And we're using the, I forget which one we're using to get the manifests for the uninstall process, but it's in there somewhere. The things that I haven't shown yet, or that aren't directly being used by the Rancher installation components, are going to be istioctl proxy status. This is going to give you basic proxy status information for an environment. Let me actually open this up over here. That's not going to work. Let's try that. There we go. Clear that out. Make that a little bit bigger. istioctl. Let me first make sure I'm in the right environment. PGDX. Istio 17. Clear istioctl proxy status. You basically specifying the proxy status that you want to look at. Maybe you pass in some flags, and that will give you all of the proxy status components that are involved. Here you can see basically the ingress gateway, the egress gateway, whether or not the discovery services, or the configurations are being properly synced. For instance, we have, for some reason, the RDS is not being sent for the egress gateway. We also have, I think that's being truncated. Yeah, we just have the version of the Istio proxy there. Similarly, we can look at the proxy config. If we do istioctl proxy config, that's going to be able to point at the cluster, the endpoint, the listeners. Let's do an istio proxy config cluster. And we're going to specify the product info. Get that. Go to the screen. And there we see all the information that this sidecar proxy has in regards to the cluster at large. So you can see all of the ports, the services, the direction, the subsets, the destination rules. So for instance, if you're familiar with the book info project, you know that the product page gets distributed to both the details service and the rating service. And there you can see details and then ratings by default. There's a lot of information there. I think that's a good way to find. Let's say you're diagnosing a problem with one of your services. Istioctl proxy config is a good way to start trying to approach that. Two other things that I'm going to mention, that I'd like to mention, I've already kind of talked about validate and analyze, is going to be the dashboard component. The dashboard component is basically just a kubectl port forward, but having access to both Control-Z and the Envoy dashboards are going to give you, again, a UI experience for debugging your service mesh. So starting with Control-Z, if we do istioctl dashboard Control-Z, and then I got to specify this guy again. Dashboard Control-Z. Let's see, I'm running on Windows, so my terminal actually can't. It can't create a Chrome browser, but if I do this and open up that window in a browser, what port was that? 9876. some reason I'm not getting access to that. I'll try a different ingress gateway. Where did my terminal go? There we go. Bring this back over here. Yeah. Istio system. Let's try it directly against the Istio D deployment. I got to specify the cube system or Istio system namespace. There we go. So hopefully this one should forward me to Envoy. Control Z. There we go. What I see here is basic information about the cluster. So if we wanted to look at the metrics, I mean, some of the metrics aren't going to be useful for human readable consumption. But for instance, if we wanted to see the Istio sidecar injection success, we could see that information. I guess there's no sidecar injections that have happened. Pilot endpoints not ready. That's another relevant one. Outside of that, you can see the command line arguments for pilot on this environment. You can see the process information, the number of threads, the number of go routines, the host name, so on and so forth. The environment variables. There's going to be a fair bit of environment variables because if you're creating just a single egress gateway or an ingress gateway, you see all these. There's chances that you're going to have multiple ingress gateways in a cluster. Memory usage, if you just want a quick look at all that stuff, and then the logging scopes. Here you can configure the logging of the various components. So there was a question previously about Citadel. Things that you would want to look at in regards to that sort of thing are going to be like the SPIFFE, the server CA, the root cert rotator. We can go to debug, debug, and then we can look at that information in the logs. And last but not least, there's going to be the Envoy dashboard. That Envoy dashboard is going to give you information, not about Pilot, but about Envoy. Click that. Paste in there. Let me choose the right one. There we go. Now I got to do a QC2. Here we go. Now we can see the Envoy dashboard. That Envoy dashboard is going to have the access to all the certs, the information about the clusters, the config dump, if you wanted to get access to the entire config. Then there should also, the stats Prometheus is going to be the actual endpoint that's going to be exposing things. This is going to be, I believe, just the Envoy configuration and not the endpoint for the application itself. I'll have to double check that though. And then we want server info and stuff like that. Hopefully you don't have to dive into there very often, but in the event that your Istio Service Mesh is misbehaving, it's nice to have that available. All right, so let me just briefly talk about, I guess, the automation approaches, and then I'll open the floor to questions. And thank you for your time. So with the release of Rancher 2.5, we introduced a tool set called Fleet. That is going to be a basic GitOps approach to deploying deploying anything in your environment. You could point it at raw Kubernetes manifests. You could point it at the Helm charts. You could point it at customized repos. You could point it at any permutation or any combination of the two or of the three. And the best way that I found, I'm still working on making a standard approach to this, but Fleet is going to allow you to say that any cluster that I provision in my environment is automatically going to get Istio deployed into it. Be it an RKE cluster, be it a K3S cluster, or whatever clusters you're adding to your environment, as long as they have the Fleet agent deployed onto them and they match the specific target, then they will get the Helm chart for both Rancher monitoring and for Istio itself. The only way that's comparable in the 2.4 world was basically using Terraform. Terraform gave you the ability to say, I want to deploy these applications into this environment. And technically, since everything that was integrated through the UI previously was accessible, was just a Helm chart, you could deploy a Helm chart with Terraform, and as long as it met the same specifications that our bundled Istio component was installed in as, it would show up and you would get the UI integration. It's a bit of a hacky solution, and so my recommendation, or I'm excited for the fact that Fleet makes it seem much more native, but you always do have the ability to do that in 2.4. And Terraform was recently updated so that it can now point to applications and catalogs in 2.5 as well. You can see here, look for Rancher 2 _catalog _v2, and then Rancher 2 _app _v2 for 2.5 installations. The way that applications and Helm charts are deployed through the new UI is fundamentally different than the way that they were deployed previously. And so the Terraform provider had to be updated to account for that. Okay, so that brings us basically to the end. The things that I'm hoping, I know this is a lot of information all at once, and I know I went kind of fast and I kind of bounce back and forth. I usually expect that the information with Istio, since it is so dense, that you find a specific thing that I mentioned. I add a lot of links in the slide presentation, so you at least know where to go to get further information. But the main purpose of this presentation, at least from my perspective, was to give you a little bit of ammunition going into the decision to either deploy Istio, either in 2.4 or 2.5, to consider what your strategy is for moving in to Istio 2.5, and then just, I guess, to have an understanding of what's been changing, where the general direction of the Istio project is these days. And so the top 5 points that I'd like to send you off with is that Istio isn't always going to be a solution that you need, or Service Mesh for that matter. It's going to be some non-negligible amount of work to deploy in your environment, and certainly to maintain it. And just make sure that you do the cost value analysis of that prior to jumping into a Service Mesh. Part number 2 is that, and this is one of the questions that we talked about, is that there is a version gap of 2 minor versions. So it's not recommended to migrate from the old version to the new version, not to mention Rancher's adding an additional layer of complexity on top of that. My recommendation, and I want it to be clear, is to uninstall it and then reinstall the Service Mesh, and then just have things join up into the new Service Mesh. And then 3, the new components do not have forms yet. I didn't spend too much time going over how to create a virtual service, a destination rule, primarily because this is more a conversation to people who had basic understanding of Istio. But we are going to build some amount of form-based creation of these resources into the Rancher product. They're just not quite there yet. If you're running Kubernetes versions less than 1.16, 1.7 has only been tested on 1.16 and above. So that might be a reason that if you're running maybe Istio already, you're getting towards the tail of the support window, that you might have to consider that sooner rather than later. And then lastly, I want to point out that Istio might not be the service mesh that you want to run. I know somebody in the chat, maybe a couple people in the chat, I haven't been following too close, mentioned Linkerd. Linkerd is a perfectly fine service mesh. And as long as it does everything that you want out of a service mesh, I would fully endorse it. That doesn't even bring into the fact that since we've released Istio, I think at least 4 or 5 standard service mesh containers have entered into the space. And there's some degree of utility in each one of them. So it's a matter of finding out what level of complexity you need and what level of complexity you're willing to undertake. Choose a service mesh that's the best fit. Cool. So with that said, if once you get these, there's going to be links available. I'm always available on the Rancher user Slack. The Rancher forums are always available. I'll check in on those. And then there's the GitHub repo if you're the sort of person that likes to check the source code. So at this, let me open up the floor for questions. I know I've got 2 minutes left. I kind of went over there. Was there anything poignant that you think I should mention before I sign off?
Maybe is a multi-cluster service mesh installation supported?
Yep. So multi-cluster installation is supported. It's a different configuration for both the overlay and the Rancher installation, but I'm working on a plan to integrate that with Fleet so that there's going to be at least one sample repo where whenever you deploy a cluster, it will automatically sync to a service mesh. And effectively what you'll have is you'll have a service mesh that constitutes all of your Rancher management clusters. The intention is for me to have that done by my masterclass in December, so stay tuned. But as far as running your own multi-cluster service mesh right now, you certainly can just use the standard Istio approach and make sure that configuration works with the distribution of Kubernetes that you're running on top of.
Great, awesome. And maybe one other question was, are you aware of anything special you have to do with Istio if you run it inside of a cluster where you use GPUs in a container?
I am not. That is an interesting question. It makes sense though, as more and more workloads or more and more Kubernetes clusters are being tasked with crunching machine learning models, that you'd want to be able to connect them. I guess there's a use case. Oh, I don't have an answer to this. I'm just rambling at this point in time. But running the inference through a service mesh does make sense. And so I would keep an eye on the Istio issues list. Because there might be some hiccups in that approach, and I'm sure you're not the first person to bring that up.
Okay, and last question I see is, do you know if Rio, which is currently using Linkerd as a service mesh inside, is it using moving to Istio at any point in time?
I don't think so. I'm not aware of any push toward Rio to switch over to Istio.
I think
Cool.
that's it from the question side.
All right. Again, apologies everyone for maybe talking too fast or changing screens too much. I'm grateful for everybody that stayed along. Like I said, I have another masterclass planned in December for multi-cluster operations. So keep an eye out for that one. Otherwise, go forth and be successful in your Kubernetes adventures.
Great. Thank you, Jason, for a great presentation today, and Bastian as well for helping with the questions. Just to wrap up, wanted to share a couple additional resources for everybody. Obviously, all of our products and our projects are open source, so head over to rancher.com to check them out. We do have another event happening tomorrow. Our November online meetup will take place at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Topic is GitOps with Rancher Continuous Delivery. So you can sign up for that at rancher.com events. And also the masterclass that Jason mentioned will also be posted on there once it is available. There were a couple mentions earlier about a more introductive training to Rancher and Kubernetes. We do hold intro trainings every Thursday I'm not sure of the time, but you can head over to, this link is wrong, but it's rancher.com/training, and you can sign up for those there. If you're fully comfortable with everything and looking to get certified, we do have Rancher Academy. You can check that out at academy.rancher.com to become a certified Rancher operator. So thank you everyone again for joining today. Have a great rest of your day.